Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems, especially economic ones. In today's podcast, I'll be celebrating the launch of Taken for a Ride, Trains, Taxpayers and the Treasury, the second edition. Now, one thing that I would like to also dedicate this podcast to Dave Wetzel, one of our co-writers who wrote a fantastic postscript to this book, who sadly died as we were going into post-production for this podcast. Somewhat fittingly, I gave Dave the final word and finished the podcast with his inspiration and encouragement for us all to take more control and to stand up for a fairer society. And so for that, I'll make no changes to the podcast, but I want everyone to know that this is in his honour. Now, Taken for a Ride, Trains, Taxpayers and the Treasury is a unique book written by an extraordinary entrepreneur and property developer named Don Riley. Don was a Kiwi who came to London in 1962 with only £200 in his pocket. And after some time studying, he began working in computers and was drawn to working with some of the biggest. He worked with some companies in the UK and eventually ended up in Moscow working for the Russian government. Now, in 1977, he formed his own firm, which was successful, and instead of renting a place for his staff, he decided to buy one. Now, given that he didn't have much money, he chose what was then a rundown part of London, Southwark, which is now very close to London Bridge Station. He enjoyed developing properties and actually stayed in the area, gradually buying more and more of the properties or development sites as they came up. Now, Don was prompted to write the book because of something he called the big lie. And in chapter 1, he explains what the big lie is, and that is simply that public investments such as transport projects generate gains that can't be captured in cash. And that's the big lie. And it's literally what government departments would tell you. And they still do. Again and again, there will be choices between what the user must pay, what the private sector operator or supplier must bear, and what the taxpayer will pay in recognition of benefits which cannot be captured in cash. Don's experience as a landowner around what was probably the most successful public investment, taxpayer investment, certainly in the post-war period, which was the Jubilee Line extension, showed that these investments made fabulous profits, but they made fabulous profits for the landowners, not for the operators of the train line. So things like the Jubilee Line extension, Crossrail, which is now the Elizabeth Line, and also unbuilt and currently stalled developments like the Bakerloo Line extension in London that's been postponed for decades, is that they could and would pay for themselves, but doing so, doing the right thing, would be perceived as political suicide, allegedly, because you then have to take on the landowners. But Don's experience of the landowners showed that public investments in well-designed property links are wildly profitable and rewarding for almost everyone. It's just that the gains go to a few select people. Now, he was a beneficiary of the Jubilee Line extension, which may be the best taxpayer investment in the post-war era, maybe longer. And on page 17, he describes how he accidentally found himself on what he describes as the gravy train. As my company expanded, I came to regard my tenants more as customers. I bought and refurbished other buildings for our use while continuing to work on industrial computer applications in Leningrad until 1991. Then the recession struck, property prices crashed, and I began to buy additional buildings in the area. And that's when I pulled out of computers, but it was hard work, and to retain my tenants, my customers, I lowered my rents by 25% during the 4 worst years of the 1990s. Now, one of the signs of a great, this is me talking now, not quoting Don, is this line shows me that Don was a genuine entrepreneur. Property prices crashed and I began to buy additional buildings. One of the best signs that you're a true entrepreneur is during a recession, you have money to invest in things. And that's the time when you'll make the most money. Now, that's not the topic of this book. That would be the topic of other works in the Shepheard-Walwyn canon. So I invite you to look at it. Let me carry on quoting Don. So in the 1990s, so he had to drop his rent by 25% during the 4 worst years of the 1990s. And then this happens. Then you, the taxpayer, in 1993 decided to foot the bill for an extension to the Jubilee line, with a station at London Bridge. I found myself aboard a gravy train, and in autumn 1995 I let 13,000 square feet and some vacant land to Costain Taylor Woodrow, the contractors for the Jubilee line extension London Bridge contract. At first, the minnows in the property market like me, the train barely moved. But larger property firms that had no presence south of the river began to buy the grander vacant sites and empty buildings. Then, by late 1997, despite the fact that the new tube line would not be open for several years, I no longer had difficulty in attracting tenants from the West End and the city, and this was when I began to understand how especially benevolent your taxpayers were to my property activities. Now, Don then goes on to explain how he first quantified the level of enrichment that he benefited from, and that the taxpayers were offering landowners in and around the properties and land around the Jubilee line extension site. And these are the gains which previously all economists, all government ministers, all civil servants had said was impossible to quantify. And Don, a simple Kiwi entrepreneur, did it all himself in Taken for a Ride. He was the first insider to document the gains that can come from land investment around taxpayer capital products. And whilst the later Savills KPMG TfL study may be more thorough, I still go with Don results, as it came from an investor and a man who knew his area so well he could refer to specific land deals that he and his friends had made, or investments that he'd failed to win based on the amount he was offering. He also shows that capitalism is amazing if you want to Adam Smith and the two principles of capitalism. And that is simply that you look to your community on what they want and need. You look at what you can offer and enjoy offering, and then you meet that need. And the greater the difference you can make over the shorter the period of time frame, the bigger your reward. Or at least that's how it should be. Now, the difference of reward is over the short and long-term rewards. So a teacher, for example, who can deliver a massive return and a massive benefit to people, but it's over a longer period of time, they make less money than someone who can make seemingly a massive transformational difference in a short space of time. Now, the problem that we have now is our economic system is in favour of short-term asset-based rewards, and that's the thing that's corrupting us all. And this is the opposite of what economics was meant to provide. It means that free riders are in charge of the system, and they're exalted as the wealth creators when they're simply the wealth beneficiaries. Community is crucial as this handles dishonest behaviour and unfairness in the system, and we've all but lost that today. Reading the book again and then doing the research into the outcome of Don's predictions shows again and again how right he was about things. For example, he criticises something that was new at the time called public-private partnerships, which was a way in which the government got the private sector to develop sites, build hospitals, build roads, so on and so forth. And in doing so, the private company would receive a stipend or a payment every year from the government. The problem with that, and he highlighted it straight away, is how bad a deal that was for us as taxpayers. Some of those deals, if you Google PPP, public-private partnerships, or PFI, public finance initiatives, and look at some of the truly appalling deals, you scratch your head and wonder how on earth anyone in their right mind could have signed it. And it makes you susceptible to things like conspiracy theories and corruption theories that the government, civil servants, ministers or whatever must have done this for their friends because they couldn't have been that stupid. And unfortunately, having seen lots of politicians over the last 5 years, I think whilst it could be corruption, they also can be that stupid. But Don picked it up in 2000 when the financial press was mostly positive about the innovation of PFIs, PPPs. But in reality, it's just another example of public investment and private profit, something that obviously when you read the book, you will see that Don hated, and we all should hate it. Now, one thing that hasn't particularly borne out from Don's predictions and preferences was the model of privatisation. Now, in areas where there's been little competition, the public has received poor standards and higher bills, such as a lot of rail service, but also water companies polluting our rivers and offering shareholders massive returns whilst they basically con us. Now, one of the funny ones was there's a fascinating excerpt in The Gravy Train and his experience advising the USSR on computers. He actually had an idea to cause their economy to collapse and grind to a halt by selling them thousands of big data processing computers. Now, this was part joke, part industrial warfare, but his experience of working with larger computers is that the bigger the data there was, the more efforts there were to control the economy from the centre, which for Don as a committed entrepreneur meant basically suicide economically. So carrying on with the book, on page 23, Don says this: "We have 200 years of experience to support the claim that the major beneficiaries are people who own the land in the locality, but the owners do nothing to improve their land to justify that increased value. Where then does the additional value come from? The increase in the value of land stems from the benefits that are produced by the investment in the new road or bridge. The process is known as capitalization, and after the costs of labour and capital have been met, the net benefits of new investment are captured by or crystallized in the land market. The increased productivity from a new road or railway, in other words, is capitalized into higher land prices, and there's solid body of academic literature that describes this process in technical detail." And now in the book, Don does go into that, and I'm going to cover that just briefly when we get into it. Now, Don's insistence that we should collect the money from public investments. As I say in the book, in the 2024 update, he was not a socialist, and this was not a socialist interventionist idea. Don wanted the least government interference as possible, and he staunchly believed that the private sector, in a market with appropriate incentives and disincentives, would always beat the public sector. He was in favour of capturing the land gains for society, not just because it was fair for everyone, but that it was the only truly capitalist or entrepreneurial solution. Having more taxes on land value gains means that there could be lower income taxes so that people could keep more of what they earned from their work. You should not be punished for working hard through income tax. And as I say in the update, we have to change our society back to a genuinely entrepreneurial one where people are rewarded for their efforts. This starts with accepting that free riding is not capitalism, and being able to sit back and watch others create value for you is morally repugnant, even if you are currently seen as a savvy business person for riding on the backs of others. I do get a little bit heated myself from time to time, as you may have realised. In chapter 4, he shows the economic theory that would generate the wealth that we're talking about, and he explains the work of Professor William Vickrey, a man who won the Nobel Prize for Economics and sadly died in a tragic accident 3 days after winning it. Now, William Vickrey, not only did he show about the tax revenue that went missing through the gains into land, but he also showed just how much we lost as a society because we're all punished for working hard through income tax. So if you were to create systems that were genuinely had the right incentives for hard work, so lower income tax on your work, essentially, we want zero income tax really on efforts, and then much more on anything around land gains, unless the entrepreneur or property developer created the gain themselves. So if someone takes an empty bit of land or some wasteland or a derelict building, transforms that into a theatre and office space, the way that Don did in what is now known as a Mania chocolate factory, theatre and office, then you should get the rewards for that. So you get rewarded for what you've done. But if gains are captured from group activity and captured by individuals who own the land, then that should be dealt with quite severely from a tax basis. What we've got is throughout the whole economic system, there are perverse incentives through the tax system. And this is actually deliberate. Now, we know there's a better way to do things, and Don's book shows this, but in societal and practical terms, through the work and through the academics. The biggest con in our history is that our economic system is the best that there is, and isn't the best system, because it's been corrupted. Economics, as I hope you realise now, is mostly made up. Now, it's couched in Darwinian terms, in evolutionary theory, and so on and so forth, but it isn't natural. The economic system, especially the tax basis that we've got, was made by people who corrupted the system and took the taxes away from land and assets and onto individuals and their incomes. Now, to give you a specific example, we can take a place called Tanner Street, which Don mentions in the book. And he talks about a piece of land or a building that before the Jubilee Line extension was approved, Don said you could have picked up for about £250,000. Shortly after the opening of the Jubilee Line extension, it was on the market for £1.5 million. Now it took a long time to sell, but eventually sold and was turned into, I think, a block of 96 apartments. And each one of those apartments now commands a £1 million price tag. So back in the 90s, you could buy the building for £250,000 to £1 million, and today one apartment costs you that. Now, a comparable building to the one that was valued at 1.5 million and didn't sell just over in 2000, sold in 2017 for £16 million. Now, do check these out because I've referenced them in the book, and let us know what you think. Now, if you're ever in London and you fancy an interesting walk, what I'd encourage you to do is get yourself to London Bridge Station, have a nice bite to eat at Borough Market, which is one of the best foodie destinations for people in London, and then walk your way over, get onto Google Maps or Waze, and look at Tanner Street, number 1 Tanner Street, and go down, walk from Tanner Street from number 1 all the way up to the higher numbers, which is around about 100 now. And what you see is how gentrification and development takes place, and it starts with making old buildings better and suited for loft living, and eventually they get knocked down and replaced with much taller structures with greater density. So instead of having a building that could handle, let's just say, 16 apartments, you have a building on the site with 40 or 50 apartments. And that's exactly what's happened down the bottom end of Tanner Street, especially at 53 to 55. And then right next to that building that Don mentions in the book, there's now a budget hotel that's pushing up to 12 and 13 stories. So it's worth a look, and you can actually see it for yourself. And that's the important thing. One of the lessons I've learned from working with Phil is the importance of going walkabout. Now, we know that Phil's an Aussie, as I'm sure you do, which is one of the traditions of an Aussie male and an Aussie female now, is to go walkabout, but to take a look for yourself and to see this for what's going on. And Tanner Street, and even looking around all of Don's properties, going to the Manier Chocolate Factory, looking at, I think it's 36 to 38 Street. It's across the road. It's all in the book. All the pictures are in the book. And just seeing these buildings and noticing how you could have bought an office block for £1 million. And again, now the cost of those structures are £1 million for one apartment. One quote that stands out for me, just going through the book now, is the something for nothing formula is not secret. The brew is not chemical, but political. It is to persuade taxpayers to finance public services and rig the rules so the landowners do not have to bear the cost of services from which they benefit. One of Don's rule number 1 was that you pay for the benefits that you get. And I'm a big fan of that. Also in the book, Don talks about different areas. He contrasts Washington, D.C. with Hong Kong. Washington, D.C., the metro that they built there, has the same economic structure and setup as does the UK. Hong Kong, they talk about how it's essentially self-financing and ethically fair for everybody. I could have spoken quite a bit about Japanese investments because there's a lot of private rail in Japan, especially in the big cities. And what you do is that companies buy the right to build a train line, and they put department stores and apartments at the end. At all the key stations, they build apartment blocks, but at the end of it, you've got a big department store, and sometimes you literally have to walk through the department store to get out of the station. So you get guaranteed footfall in a department store, and that's how they pay for railways and train investments. In places like Hong Kong and Singapore, what you've got is a much more aggressive approach to buying land, which is then going to be improved. So, for example, if you look at the Singapore government and how they've basically added a few miles worth of land all the way across the island and then built on it, is that they buy the land, they own the land, and they lease it back to people. So the capital gain of that land, as that city-state becomes more and more valuable, comes back to the citizens. And that is a much, much better approach to do. Now, in chapter 6, he talks about the Treasury albatross. Conservative governments in the 19th century set the scene for a cannibalistic system of taxation that attacked the capitalist system at its heart, the capacity to add value to the nation's wealth. Those governments championed the interests of an aristocratic culture that was parasitic on people who earned their living. And the result that we've got, according to Don, and I absolutely agree with this, is the tax philosophy has distorted the scale of people's savings. The result was a social and economic system that underperformed by enormous margins. And despite their ingenuity, people have been discouraged from maximising their full potential as human beings. Unemployment, poverty and nightmare housing were not the consequence of capitalism. They were the result of government policies that disempowered people. And this, Don goes into this in more detail in the book, and we also have updated it. And one of the things we've absolutely had is a fabulous interview with Steve Norris, the then government minister. And in the book, he explains how he had to basically force through the investment in the Jubilee line, which, remember, is possibly the greatest investment, the greatest government investment that we've had absolutely since the Second World War. In the podcast interview as well, Steve goes into more detail on this. And that interview in and of itself was inspiring to meet someone who served in government relatively recently, who was so committed to improving our society, but also deeply depressing, because when I look at certainly the previous Conservative government, but also increasingly when I look at the early interactions of these people that are now in charge in the country, the Labour ministers, I don't see them being much better, really. They may be less corrupt for now, but there's such a distinct lack of vision and also a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy runs. Now, obviously, there's some bad news in this, and Don he doesn't hold back on his criticisms. But in Chapter 7, which he calls a win-win public finance, he actually puts forward, and building on the economic arguments that were written earlier, he says this. He said, "Why do I, the landowner, advocate a tax policy that would target my income from land?" He said, "There are two reasons. First, everyone would get richer if we got rid of deadweight taxes. Secondly, the negative influence of taxation on the property industry, out of which I make my living, is crippling. Builders bear a heavy risk, part of which they shift onto their workers. And this is why we rely so much on subcontractors, which is not a secure arrangement for people who support families. Taxation is directly responsible for fragmenting the construction sector, which then imposes stresses on people's lives that leads to the fragmentation of society at large. Ultimately, society's failure to value its land and use is also responsible for homelessness and poor quality housing, but there's no sustainable solutions for dealing with the perpetual social crisis within the plans administered by governments and their bureaucracies. The fundamental solution is to harness the power of the free market by adopting tax reforms in which everybody wins." Now, as I record this, we have literally just had the new Labour government put out some truly extraordinary targets for building new homes across the country. They've actually set the target of 1.5 million homes to be built in the next 5 years, which, based on previous experience and the current constraints on the property market and on the planning sector and everything else, well, it's frankly impossible. It's frankly impossible. Even if we had a fair tax system, it would be wildly challenging and extraordinarily ambitious. But without changing the fundamental drivers of our property market, which is a tax structure, there is no way of that going to happen. Now, one of the things that Don also criticises in the book is Gordon Brown and the ideas. And he said Gordon Brown's ideas would lead to nothing. And as we document in the book, Brown's most significant acts were the sell-off of the gold reserves in a way that guaranteed the lowest price possible, which cost us billions. But he also saw himself as the best chancellor in 200 years, and he made the claim of defeating the boom-bust cycle. And he made this claim literally 6 months before the UK economy collapsed. And then we had the Northern Rock scandal. He even receives credit for being a global statesman, for putting together the deal that allegedly saved the global economic market, or the Western economic system. The thing that no one talks about, and maybe most people don't know, which we know, is that he had all the information he needed to transform the economic cycle forever, genuinely, not just to talk about it, but genuinely. And I know for a fact, Fred Harrison, who supported Don Riley in writing the original version of this book, and Fred writes the introduction, Fred had meetings with Gordon Brown's key advisors, and he went on about the property cycle and the land crash and the boom bust cycle of 2006, 7, 8, which was entirely accurate and correct. To such an extent that Alistair Campbell sent him a note telling him to cheer up and basically to stop going on about the coming crash and instead to enjoy the boom, which Labour claimed was down to them, when it was really Gordon Brown riding the latest 18-year cycle. And he did nothing. One of the things you may ask yourself is, John, this is all very well, but how on earth can a lie so big last for so long? And it's a great example of those in charge hiding real problems and solutions. Don's book is a testimony to this. The big lie that you can't capture the cash value gains from public investments was proven wrong by one motive entrepreneur and genuine capitalist. Now, on page 116, Don explains how one of the key ways that this lie is propagated because you make it invisible by pretending that you can't collect the data. And this is a good sign that people are lying to you when you say, do you know what, why don't we have, for example, a full land registry? It may surprise you to know that a great deal of land in the UK is the owners of that land is unknown and it's not recorded. And the government and other people, their agents, say it's not possible to gain. It's not possible to register, to sort that out. When it's just rich people avoiding paying tax. Now, one of the things that Don goes on about is solving the problem for paying for transport identifies a solution to an even greater problem, the instability of the economy. My realization that the greater than 100% gain for landowners with sites alongside new transport links led me to examine the mechanism of all land gains by landowners and to reflect on the counterbalancing losses in the community. And once I realized that there was a general connection between land, taxation and the business cycle, I understood that the correct financing of transport systems would also deliver the most powerful tool for countering the malignant effects of boom-bust cycles. And we are in what maybe, in my opinion, maybe the last big one that we've got now, and our governments are doing nothing. The new Labour government is behaving exactly as you'd expect a Conservative government to behave. Just recently, within weeks of coming into office, they've just cut winter heating allowances for 10 million pensioners and have launched forced targets for house building around the country. And as I've said, it's just absolutely crazy. So even with what we know as a winner's curse phase in the systems and economics, there can be opportunities for you to make money out of this corrupt system. Now, I don't see the contradiction in this, as I firmly believe that the gain is better in your hands than in others. So be fair, be creative and make a difference. And take inspiration from Don's extraordinary developments at 169 Aborough High Street or the Mania Chocolate Factory, where he came in and delivered something of genuine value to the people. But just remember that the gain on unimproved land or property, maybe on your balance sheet, doesn't actually belong to you. So spend it wisely and spend it on people that you care about, and use that money to make a difference and to raise awareness of the challenges that we face. Now, what I want to do is I want to finish off my conversation around this whole topic and how, as Don says, the privatisation of rent corrupts the productive capacity of the economy and corrupts the fibre of public life. But I want to finish off with a quote from Dave Wetzel. Now, Dave was the deputy or the vice chair of Transport for London. And if you ever use a London transport system, then you will be a beneficiary of his commitment and work to improving train systems and transport systems around London. And he did a massive amount of work, as he says in his podcast, around how to improve the buses, real practical stuff that made things better, made them more reliable, and just made them easier for customers. Now, this is how we finish the book. We are left with an economic system that is unfair, in which people are punished for doing the right thing. Attempts to improve the lives of ordinary people are met with relentless criticism, and the idea that the Jubilee Line investments were seen as unnecessary or not worth the cost is incredible today, given the extraordinary way in which it transformed London. The same criticisms are presented to Crossrail and any other investment that improves normal people's lives. What Don's book, Taken for a Ride, and all the research since has shown is that not only are they worthwhile, but they serve all of us. We live on a planet where all the benefits from the economy and land were once shared by all. Today, that equitable and just system has been usurped by landowners who provide nothing to the production process except permission for someone else to do the work. It is up to all of us, of whatever political persuasion, to introduce fairness, harmony, and most importantly, justice in our economic system. Now, ladies and gents, if you're a fan of this work and you're listening to me, then you're going to be familiar with the work of Fred Harrison and Phil Anderson and the way in which a property cycle causes booms, busts in the Western and global economy. And if you've followed that work over the years, you will know that we are now heading into the final boom phase of the last great boom in the West, in my opinion. It's not Phil's opinion or Fred's opinion, that's mine. But what is a united opinion is that we are heading for an almighty crash after one last boom. So you've got 2-3 years max before the next crash hits. Now, in the book, what I don't go into in much detail is for you to be able to quantify and to assess the likelihood that a public investment will make a big difference to land values in the area. In which case, there's still a chance for you to make money out of the land cycle. You just got to be extremely careful now. But what you've also got to do is to prepare yourselves and people you care about to be able to address and deal with the pending crash, which is inevitable and will be coming because we have not changed the tax system to address this boom-bust cycle. And this is my wish, is that you join us in this campaign and you join us on the campaign for ethical economics so that we can start at the very least to offer people an alternative to the lies that suggest and tell us that this is the only economic system we can have and that the choice is between capitalism and Marxism, communism or whatever it is. It isn't. For me, the choice is, and the opportunity is, that we have a genuinely capitalist system where individuals are rewarded for their efforts and we deal with free riders, the single biggest economic problem in our society, once and for all. And we do that simply by changing the tax system and overcoming the resistance that would come from the land-owning media owners who would stop this idea and would attack politicians who were campaigning for a fairer system for all of us. But that's the situation that we've got for ourselves, and that's the fight that we're inviting you to join us with. So please subscribe, please get involved. So do read Fred's book, Boom Bust. Read Phil Anderson's Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. Read The Corruption of Economics, a truly, truly important work that we're currently working on how to get more attention for that work, because the story is unbelievable. But absolutely true, led by Mason Gaffney, Fred Harrison and Chris Feeder. So do look into that, and let's see you on the next podcast. Thanks very much. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.